the other day I made a community post saying I wouldn't talk about the Venato Prime. However, I have to talk about this, because the Venato Prime is so unique, it would have had the chance to completely change the way we build many weapons and warframes. But the thing is, it just doesn't work. So, in this Warframe guide, I have of course a super strong Venato Prime build for you all, but mainly I want to talk about what could have been and why it makes me so sad that it didn't work out. Big shoutouts as always to all our generous channel members, and now let's get right to it. But one thing after the other, first let's talk about where you can get the Venato Prime for yourself, and this is actually pretty darn simple. As a Prime weapon, it comes out of Void Relics, those being the Lith E2, the Axii V13 and the Meso G9. As always, best way to farm the Axii one would be the mission Apollo on Lua, for the Lith one, Hepit in the Void, and then for the Meso one there are multiple options, however the Sedna Disruption Kappa is usually the preferred method. So run those missions, crack open the relics, and build the Venato Prime for yourself. But now, let's talk about the Venato Prime itself. What exactly is going on here? Well, first of all, the most obvious thing, the Venato Prime is a Scythe-type weapon. We have a lot of Scythe-type weapons in the game, and that means it has access to two stances, those being Reaping Spiral and Stalking Fan. First downside here is that the polarity that it comes with initially in the stance slot matches Stalking Fan, when in reality we ideally would like to go for Reaping Spiral, as it is commonly seen as the better option. Now, would I recommend reformatting the stance slot in order to make it happen? Honestly, I would say no, because I don't necessarily think that this weapon is worth the extra investment. We're gonna get to that in a minute. So for our builds later in this video, we're gonna stick to Stalking Fan. In terms of base stats, this weapon is actually pretty darn good, with 34 whopping % crit chance, 2.3 times multiplier, and also 32% status chance, so we can, deal some numbers with this. It's not the best scythe out there. We have a lot of very strong contenders here, right? We have the Hate Incarnon, we have Lich Scythes, and if you want to go for heavy attacks, we have the Harmony, which is the best heavy attack weapon in the game. So even with these high stats, the Venato Prime will not be able to compete with those top tier scythes. However, and that is something that Brozime said in his video on the Venato Prime, and I couldn't agree more, for a Master Rank 14 scythe that is relatively easy to acquire at this point in time, we are dealing with a pretty strong weapon by just the stats alone already. However, and this is the point where it really gets interesting, the Venato Prime has a unique trait that is very, very special, because it is the only tool in the entire game that allows to do this. And that is that whenever you trigger a status effect with it, you will also deal a forced Tau status effect to the same enemy at the same time. Now, if you're a bit more experienced with Warframe, you know what a Tau status effect is, and you know that Caliban is the only Warframe in the game who has even access to this. Every other Warframe in the game can't even inflict this no matter what. So that's the reason why the Venato Prime is so incredibly unique, because with its addition, it now allows any Warframe in the game to spread Tau, not only Caliban, just by wielding it. Now, you might be wondering, what is so special about Tau? Well, the thing with Tau is that it's actually a super duper strong status effect. It increases the enemy's vulnerability to status chance. Or in other words, it's kind of like a final status chance multiplier. A Tau status effect can stack up from 1 to a maximum of 10 procs, and for each proc, the effect gets 10% stronger, meaning at a max stack, you have 100% more status chance against the enemy that has the 10 procs on them. Very important to mention here, this status chance bonus coming from the Tau status effects is multiplicative to the final status chance that you have on your weapon. So in other words, 10 Tau status effects means whatever the status chance on your weapon is, that then gets doubled against the affected enemies, which would make it very clear as to why this is so incredibly strong. But alright, that all in all sounded pretty darn good, so why was I complaining in the intro of the video? What is the big disappointment about this weapon? Well, that is exactly what I want to talk about next. Before that though, make sure to hit the like button, because otherwise I'm gonna put 10 Tau procs on you. Cheers so much for your support. Alright, now, This is where the yap session and the complaining begins, so brace yourselves. Let's first of all take a very precise look on the description of the unique trait. It says, and I quote, "on status effect, inflict Tau status effect." And then the rest is plus 50% additional combo count when wielded by Caliban, but we don't care about that. We care about on status effect, inflict a Tau status effect. To me, from how it's worded, this sounds like for every status effect inflicted, you will inflict a Tau status effect. However, that is unfortunately not how it works. In reality, the game does not care how many status effects you apply. If you inflict, let's say, 3 status effects with 1 hit, then from my interpretation, if it says on status effect, that should mean that you also apply 3 Tau status effects, but you don't, you just do 1. Also, if you use, let's say, melee afflictions, which massively increases the amount of status effects on an enemy whenever you fling them into the air and knock them down, well, to be 100% fair, it does work. However, it is very weird and it kind of feels like there's something wrong in the code there, because the way that melee afflictions works is, if with the very hit that lifts the enemy up into the air, you already inflict a status effect, then this status effect will already benefit from melee afflictions. As you can also see in the background right here, the 1 corrosive I inflicted with the lifting hit already gets multiplied by melee afflictions. However, with the Tau status effect, yes, it gets multiplied by melee afflictions, but here, in contrast to any other status effects, you first have to apply the Tau with a normal attack, and then you have to perform a lifting attack, but in practice this is very clunky to play and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. Up to personal preference, of course, you can definitely try it out if you like. And what about melee duplicate? This arcane undeniably says yellow melee crits hit twice. 1 hit is registered as 2 hits. So, does the Venato Prime with melee duplicate inflict 2 Tau status effects on a hit? No, also not. Oh yeah, and of course, melee influence also doesn't work. If you spread any status effect through melee influence, then those spread status effects will also not inflict any additional Taus. You need to physically touch the enemy with the weapon, everyone else doesn't care. Meaning, if you want to have the 10 Tau stacks on an enemy, then you have to go through 10 physical swings of the weapon. Nothing you can do about it. In case I'm missing something, please put it in the comments down below because I'm dying to find a way to stack that up faster. Now, you might be wondering, why is that such a big deal to me? And the reason I feel this way is relatively simple, because there are a lot of builds and weapons in the game that would be very darn cool if we could just squeeze out a tiny little bit more status chance. And while there's tons and tons and tons of ways to increase our crit, with status chance, there's not really a universal final status chance multiplier except Tau status effects. So if it was possible to inflict multiple Taus at once, just like any other status effect, then this could lead to some absolutely crazy synergies with the Venato Prime as a purely support weapon. But now that I'm done with my yap session, let's take a look at the builds where I have 2 ones prepared for you. The first one is your standard melee influence build that deletes entire rooms just like any other weapon does. And then the second build is much more special, specifically tailored towards making the Venato Prime work in this aforementioned support role. With this build it works somewhat decent, but let's not get ahead of ourselves and first take a look at the main damage dealing build. This right here is what we're dealing with, and yes, I can hear you, it's a standard melee influence build, because melee influence is the most meta thing for melees. I can't change it, so yeah, we go with Blood Rush and Weeping Wounds for a crit chance and status chance, because this is a light attack build where we only use the occasional Tennokai heavy attack, Shocking Touch because we need electricity for melee influence, Berserker Fury for our attack speed. You could use Prime Fury, you could use Normal Fury, you could use any other attack speed mod you want. I personally am just a fan of Berserker Fury and always have been. Galvanized Elementalist for more status damage because we're going to deal a lot of status effects with our electricity and the high status chance. Then Prime Smite Grineer, or whichever faction mod you want to go for, If you do not want to go for a faction mod because you hate it, and I can already see the top-rated comment under the video being somebody who says that they don't like faction mods, I hear you. If you don't like it, then you go with something like Primed Reach. More range for the weapon is always good. In fact, if you think that you definitely need Primed Reach, then I would actually incentivize you to replace the attack speed mod, maybe with the faction damage. Just make sure to have some sort of faction damage ideally. If you have, let's say, a Roar Subzoom, then this right here would be the way to go. If you don't have Roar Subzoom, then put your faction damage into here and get your attack speed from somewhere else. Just, try to have a little bit of everything. For the base damage, we'll go with Condition Overload. You could technically go for a Prime Pressure Point right here, but given the fact that every hit applying a status effect will also give us another Tau, that means we're at least going to have 2 status effects on the enemy after the first swing already, so it's kind of hard to justify going for Prime Pressure Point. You have enough status effects on the enemy to, have Condition Overload be the better option. And finally, our crit damage is going to come from Galvanized Steel. Yes, I know it's technically a crit chance mod, but the second effect down there with the 30% crit damage makes it actually a better crit damage mod than all other crit damage mods. And then finally, in the stands, I go with Stalking Fan, as I said at the beginning of the video, because I don't think it's worth it to add the additional forma to reforma this slot to be able to fit Raping Spiral. I don't think the weapon is good enough to justify this investment. If you wanted to, then yeah, technically Raping Spiral would be my favorite. As for the Tennokai mod, go with whichever one you like. I like Discipline's Merit because of the consistency. You're free to go with whatever else you want. And yeah, as you also see in this little example gameplay in the background, this melee influence build performs just like any other melee influence build on any half-decent weapon. It deletes your standard seal path enemies, yada yada yada, you all know how it goes. Let's rather talk about the more interesting build, that being the aforementioned support setup, where we use the Venato Prime not to actually deal damage, just to inflict as many Tau status effects as quickly as possible to benefit from the status chance multiplier that those give us. First of all, in the Arcane slot, it doesn't matter. As we just said, Melee Duplicate does not work. Melee Influence does not work. Melee Afflictions does work, but is hella cringe. None of the arcanes that would theoretically make us apply more Tau status, all of them don't work, so you can really go with whatever you like here. I went with Melee Exposure because it gives us additional corrosive damage, so we can weave in 1 or 2 corrosive status procs at the same time, stripping away a bit of armor. I think that's kind of decent. And then for the rest of the build, the most important thing is that we have at least 100% status chance. Having more than 100% technically doesn't help, because no matter how many status effects we apply per hit, we will always only deal 1 Tau. That's why I opted for exactly 100% and not more, and rather took all the rest of the build space here to go into attack speed. I made this thing as fast as I possibly could, because, as I also said previously, the only way to make us apply those Tau status procs faster is just by hitting the enemy much faster. So Prime Fury it is, plus Quickening, plus Gladiator Vice, plus Reach so we hit more enemies at the same time, and then to get the 100% status chance, I went with Viral right here, plus Melee Prowess, bringing us pretty much exactly to 100%. You could go for Weeping Wounds if you wanted to, but remember, we're using it as a support weapon, so it might be that we're struggling to stack up the combo in the first place. And then finally, one definite recommendation from my side would be Lasting Sting, making it so that the status effects stay on the enemy for longer. Otherwise, it can happen that those nice Tau status effects will start to disappear before you can even switch the Venato Prime out for your main means of dealing damage. It still works decently well, and I'm very curious to hear in the comments down below which synergies you can cook up with it. So let us know. And if you also want to know everything about Caliban Prime, who came together with Venato, then don't miss this video right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostalix Gaming, Turtle Pier, Ondakanio 2, Skylar Bowser, Mihawky, Phil the Meme, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Shadow Lockhart, Hound Tagas, Patrisator, Boomio1, Mr. Games Plays, Zave, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.